Most people assume brain aging is inevitable. Slower recall, foggy concentration, names that sit just beyond reach. By midlife, many adults notice subtle changes in memory and mental speed. And research shows that after about age 60, certain brain regions can shrink by roughly 1 to 2% per year. But here's the surprising part. Under the right conditions, some of those same brain structures can grow again. Yes, grow. This raises a fascinating evolutionary puzzle. If the brain is one of the most protected organs in the human body, why does it appear to decline so predictably in modern life? And more importantly, why do certain behaviors seem to reverse parts of that decline? Here's what most people miss. Your brain did not evolve to stay sharp while sitting still. For hundreds of thousands of years, cognitive vitality depended on a very specific relationship between movement, exploration, and survival. When that relationship disappears, the brain responds exactly as evolution designed it to. Your brain is not failing. It is responding to its environment. And once you understand that ancient design, the path to protecting and even rejuvenating brain function becomes much clearer. I'm Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I've spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now I'm here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to the evolution. If you enjoy understanding the science behind how our bodies truly work, consider subscribing. Each episode explores another evolutionary mystery shaping modern health. And to understand how to slow and sometimes reverse aspects of brain aging, we have to start much earlier in human history, long before gyms, offices, or retirement ever existed. To understand why certain behaviors can slow and sometimes reverse aspects of brain aging, we have to begin with a basic evolutionary fact. The human brain did not evolve in stillness. For most of our species' history, cognition and movement were inseparable. Thinking was rarely a sedentary activity. It happened while walking across landscapes, tracking animals, gathering plants, navigating terrain, or cooperating with others in small social groups. In other words, the brain evolved in motion. This relationship between movement and cognition runs deeper than most people realize. In ancestral environments, survival depended on a continuous feedback loop between physical activity and mental processing. A hunter scanning the horizon had to interpret distant shapes. A gatherer moving through a forest had to remember where seasonal foods appeared. A group navigating unfamiliar territory had to build mental maps of landscapes that stretched for miles. The brain wasn't simply reacting, it was constantly updating, and that required energy, stimulation, and something surprisingly mechanical: movement itself. Here is the part that often surprises people. When your body moves rhythmically, walking, hiking, carrying, climbing, your brain receives a cascade of biological signals that support neural maintenance and growth. Blood flow increases, growth factors circulate, neural networks strengthen through use. In modern neuroscience, one molecule has received particular attention: brain-derived neurotrophic factor, often abbreviated as BDNF. BDNF acts almost like a fertilizer for neurons. It supports the growth of new connections and helps protect existing brain cells from degeneration. Studies consistently show that moderate aerobic activity, even simple walking, can significantly increase BDNF production. But this is not a modern biohacking trick. It is a reflection of ancient biology. Our brains evolved expecting daily physical exploration. When that expectation is met, the brain behaves differently, which leads to an important realization. The human brain is not designed merely to think. It is designed to think while moving through the world. And that distinction matters enormously for aging. In ancestral hunter-gatherer societies, older adults remained physically active far longer than many people today. They gathered food, cared for grandchildren, shared ecological knowledge, and moved across the landscape with their communities. Their movement patterns changed with age, often slower, often less intense, but they rarely stopped moving entirely. And that sustained activity appears to have helped preserve cognitive vitality. Anthropologists studying foraging populations have repeatedly observed that elders often serve as knowledge repositories. They remember migration routes, medicinal plants, weather patterns, and social relationships spanning decades. In evolutionary terms, their brains remained useful. But here is where the story becomes more complicated. The environments that shaped our brains are very different from the environments many people inhabit today. Modern life often separates thinking from movement. We sit while we work. We sit while we learn. We sit while we communicate. A typical office worker may spend 8 to 10 hours per day seated. Retirement for many individuals can reduce daily movement even further, and this creates an evolutionary mismatch. The brain still expects stimulation through physical exploration, but the environment delivers long periods of stillness instead, which leads to a surprising shift inside the brain itself. And this is where the modern misunderstanding about brain aging truly begins. The modern brain faces a problem evolution never prepared it for: extended stillness. For most of human history, prolonged sitting simply did not exist. Humans rested, certainly, but rest was usually brief and interspersed with frequent bouts of walking, gathering, carrying, and social interaction. Movement was not exercise, it was the structure of daily life. Today, the pattern is reversed. A large proportion of adults spend the majority of their waking hours seated, at desks, in cars, on sofas, or in front of screens. In many industrialized countries, the average adult now sits between 8 and 11 hours per day, and the brain notices. One of the regions most sensitive to this shift is the hippocampus, a structure deeply involved in memory formation and spatial navigation. The hippocampus is remarkably adaptable, but it is also vulnerable to inactivity. When physical activity declines, several biological changes begin to unfold. Blood flow to the brain becomes less dynamic. Growth factors like BDNF decrease. Neural connections that depend on stimulation become weaker. Over time, the brain reallocates resources. That may sound alarming, but from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. The brain is an expensive organ. Although it represents only about 2% of body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest. Natural selection strongly favored mechanisms that conserve energy whenever possible. If an environment signals that exploration is no longer necessary, if movement disappears, the brain gradually shifts toward efficiency rather than expansion. This is not failure. It is adaptation. Your brain is responding exactly as it evolved to. But here is where things become interesting. The human brain also evolved to be unusually plastic throughout life. Compared with many other species, our brains retain the capacity to reorganize and adapt well into older age, which means that the signals of inactivity can also be reversed. And one of the most powerful signals the brain recognizes is surprisingly simple: sustained walking. Research from neuroscience laboratories has repeatedly shown that regular walking programs can produce measurable changes in the aging brain. In one well-known study, adults in their 60s and 70s who walked several times per week for about a year showed an increase in hippocampal volume of roughly 2%. That might sound small, but in the context of brain aging, it is remarkable. Instead of shrinking slightly, which is the typical pattern, that region of the brain grew, which leads to a counterintuitive realization. Protecting the aging brain may have less to do with mental exercises than with physical exploration. Modern culture often frames cognitive health in terms of puzzles, apps, or brain training programs. These activities can certainly be stimulating, but they do not fully replicate the environmental signals our brains evolved to expect. In ancestral settings, cognitive challenges were embedded within movement. A person walking through varied terrain processes, constantly shifting visual information. Balance systems activate. Memory circuits track location and direction. Attention moves between landscape, sound, and social interaction. The brain becomes fully engaged. Sitting still, even while solving a complex puzzle, activates only part of that network, which brings us to a deeper evolutionary insight. Human intelligence did not evolve in isolation from the body. It evolved as part of a moving organism navigating complex environments. And when that organism stops moving for long periods, the brain receives a very different message about how much neural investment is necessary. This is where the real misunderstanding begins. Many people interpret declining focus or memory as an unavoidable consequence of aging. In reality, part of that decline may reflect a quieter signal, the brain receiving fewer of the environmental cues it evolved to depend upon. And this leads to an important shift in perspective. The goal is not to fight aging with heroic effort. The goal is to recreate, even in small ways, the environmental conditions under which the human brain evolved to stay sharp. Because when those signals return, the brain often responds more quickly than we expect, and that realization opens the door to a very different way of thinking about cognitive longevity. At this point, many people assume the solution is straightforward: exercise more. But the evolutionary story is a little more nuanced than that. Because the brain did not evolve to respond specifically to exercise, that concept is relatively modern. For most of human history, people did not engage in structured workouts designed to improve health. Instead, they moved with purpose. They explored landscapes. They searched for resources. They traveled between camps. They followed animals, seasons, and water. Movement was embedded in curiosity and survival. And this distinction matters more than it might seem. One of the most fascinating discoveries in neuroscience over the past few decades is how strongly the brain responds to novelty, to unfamiliar environments, and changing surroundings. When humans move through new spaces, the hippocampus becomes particularly active. It begins building what neuroscientists call cognitive maps. These maps allow us to remember where things are located, how to navigate through space, and how to anticipate the environment ahead. For a hunter-gatherer walking through varied terrain, this ability was essential. But here is where things become interesting. The hippocampus does not simply store spatial information. It also plays a central role in forming memories and integrating experiences across time. In other words, the same brain system that helps you remember where you parked your car also helps you remember conversations, events, and knowledge, which means something surprising. When we explore physical environments, we are also stimulating the neural circuits responsible for memory itself. This creates a powerful evolutionary feedback loop. Movement stimulates exploration. Exploration stimulates cognitive mapping. Cognitive mapping strengthens memory systems. And this relationship persists throughout life. But modern environments have quietly weakened that loop. Consider the structure of a typical day for many adults. They wake up in the same room, walk through the same hallway, commute along the same roads, sit in the same chair, look at the same screens. The environment becomes predictable. From an efficiency standpoint, the brain adapts by reducing the resources devoted to mapping and exploration. Why invest energy in constantly updating spatial models when the surroundings rarely change? Again, this is not a flaw. It is a form of conservation. But over years and decades, this reduction in environmental stimulation can subtly reduce the activity of the very brain regions responsible for learning and memory. And this is where a deeper insight emerges. Protecting the aging brain may depend less on intensity of movement and more on variability of movement. A slow walk through a new park can stimulate the brain differently than a repetitive workout on a stationary machine. A hike along unfamiliar trails activates navigation systems that remain quiet during routine indoor exercise. Even small changes in environment, different streets, uneven terrain, varied landscapes, create richer sensory input for the brain to process. And that processing matters. Your brain evolved to remain engaged with a changing world. This is one reason anthropologists often observe that older adults in traditional societies remain cognitively active long into later life. Their environments continue to demand attention. Landscapes change, seasons shift, social networks remain dynamic, the brain stays involved. Modern environments, by contrast, often prioritize convenience and predictability. Navigation apps guide every route. Climate-controlled buildings reduce environmental variation. Digital communication replaces many forms of physical exploration. Life becomes easier, but biologically, it also becomes quieter. And this creates a paradox. The very technologies designed to simplify modern life may inadvertently remove many of the signals that once kept the brain stimulated, which leads to a culturally contrarian idea. The fastest way to support long-term brain health may not be adding more cognitive tasks. It may be reintroducing exploration, not extreme adventures, not heroic athletic feats, just the regular experience of moving through the world in varied and unpredictable ways, walking new routes, exploring unfamiliar neighborhoods, spending time in natural environments where sensory information constantly shifts. These behaviors may seem simple, but they activate deeply ancient systems within the brain, and those systems evolve to remain active across the entire human lifespan. Which brings us to an important shift in perspective. If the brain responds to environmental signals, then protecting cognitive function is not primarily a matter of discipline. It is a matter of design. The environments we inhabit quietly shape the future of our brains, and understanding that principle leads to a far more practical question. How do we design modern life so the brain receives the signals it evolved to need? If the brain responds to environmental signals, then protecting cognitive vitality becomes less about willpower and more about design. This is an important shift. Modern health advice often emphasizes motivation, the idea that individuals must discipline themselves to exercise more, think harder, or maintain perfect habits. But from an evolutionary perspective, behavior is rarely driven by discipline alone. It is shaped by environment. For most of human history, daily surroundings naturally encouraged movement, exploration, and social interaction. People did not need to schedule activity into their day. Their environment required it. Water had to be collected. Food had to be gathered. Paths had to be traveled. Movement was simply part of being alive. Modern environments are organized very differently. Technology reduces the need to move. Transportation replaces walking. Digital tools replace navigation. Food arrives at the door. Work often happens within a single chair. Convenient, certainly, but biologically unfamiliar. And this mismatch gradually reduces the signals that keep the brain engaged. So the question becomes surprisingly practical. How can we reshape everyday environments so movement and exploration return naturally? The answer often lies in small structural changes rather than dramatic lifestyle overhauls. Consider walking. Not walking as a workout, but walking as transportation, choosing to walk part of a commute, walking to nearby errands, walking after meals. These moments accumulate quietly across the week, providing the brain with regular bursts of movement and sensory stimulation. The key is frequency. Our ancestors rarely moved in a single intense session, followed by long inactivity. Instead, activity occurred throughout the day in shorter, repeated bouts. From the brain's perspective, these frequent signals may be more biologically meaningful than occasional intense exercise. Another environmental lever involves variety, exploring different routes while walking, visiting unfamiliar parks, spending time in landscapes where visual and auditory information constantly changes. These variations activate neural systems responsible for navigation and memory. Even modest novelty matters. A different path through a neighborhood can challenge the brain to update its internal map. A new environment encourages attention and curiosity. Over time, these experiences stimulate cognitive circuits that otherwise remain underused. And this brings us to a subtle but powerful principle. The brain thrives on mild uncertainty, not chaos, not stress, but gentle unpredictability, environments that require the brain to observe, interpret, and adapt. Natural landscapes are particularly effective at providing this kind of stimulation. Uneven ground activates balance systems. Shifting light patterns engage visual processing. Sounds and scents change continuously. In evolutionary terms, the brain recognizes these signals as meaningful. Urban environments can provide similar stimulation when approached with curiosity rather than routine. Different streets, markets, public spaces, or cultural events introduce sensory diversity that engages the brain in ways screens often cannot. None of this requires extreme effort, and that is the deeper point. Your brain does not demand heroic workouts or elaborate training programs. It simply expects the kinds of environmental signals that shaped human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years. When those signals disappear, cognitive systems gradually quiet down. When they return, the brain often responds, which is why a surprisingly simple pattern emerges in many studies of healthy aging. Individuals who remain physically mobile, socially engaged, and environmentally curious tend to preserve cognitive function longer. Not because they are fighting aging, but because their daily lives continue to resemble the conditions under which the human brain evolved to thrive. And this realization returns us to the question we began with. If the brain evolved to stay sharp through movement and exploration, what does that mean for the way we think about aging itself? Let's return to the question we began with. If the brain is one of the most protected organs in the human body, why does it appear to decline so predictably with age? From an evolutionary perspective, the answer may be simpler than we expect. The brain does not age in isolation. It ages within an environment. For most of human history, that environment continuously stimulated the mind. Landscapes changed, social groups shifted, resources had to be located, remembered, and shared. Even in later adulthood, individuals remained embedded in dynamic physical and social worlds. Movement continued, exploration continued, learning continued. In that context, the brain had strong evolutionary incentives to remain engaged, but modern life has altered that relationship. Many of the signals that once kept cognitive systems active have been reduced or removed. Physical exploration declines, daily environments become predictable, digital tools increasingly perform tasks that once required memory and navigation. Convenience replaces engagement, and over time, the brain adapts to that quieter landscape. This is where a subtle misunderstanding about aging often arises. When people notice changes in memory or focus, they frequently assume their brain is deteriorating simply because they are getting older. Age certainly plays a role, Biological systems do change across the lifespan, but the pace and expression of those changes are strongly influenced by environment. Your brain is not a machine that inevitably breaks down with time. It is a responsive organ, constantly adjusting to the signals it receives. This response makes evolutionary sense. If an organism no longer needs to navigate, explore, or remember complex landscapes, the brain gradually reallocates energy away from those systems. But when those signals return, movement, novelty, social interaction, neural circuits often respond with surprising flexibility. This capacity for adaptation is one of the defining features of the human brain. Even later in life, the brain retains the ability to strengthen connections, form new pathways, and reorganize itself in response to experience. Neuroscientists refer to this property as plasticity, and plasticity persists far longer than many people realize, which leads to an important identity shift. What feels like cognitive decline may sometimes reflect environmental quiet rather than irreversible damage. Your brain is not failing, it is responding as it evolved too. Once you see aging through this evolutionary lens, the conversation changes. The goal is not to chase youth or eliminate every sign of aging. Evolution never designed the body for perpetual peak performance. Instead, our biology reflects trade-offs that allowed humans to survive, reproduce, and pass knowledge across generations. Aging is part of that story, but cognitive vitality is also part of it. Humans evolved unusual longevity compared with many species. Anthropologists often point to the value older adults provided within early human groups, knowledge keepers who remembered landscapes, traditions, and survival strategies. Their experience mattered. And for that knowledge to remain useful, the brain had to remain functional for decades beyond reproductive age. In other words, the aging brain was never meant to shut down quickly. It was meant to remain engaged with the world, which brings us back to a surprisingly simple idea. The fastest way to support long-term brain health is not to battle your biology, it is to reconnect with it. Move through the world, explore unfamiliar places, allow curiosity to guide your attention, not because these behaviors are trendy or optimized, but because they are ancient. They are the conditions under which the human brain evolved to stay alive, adaptive, and curious throughout the lifespan. And when we recreate even small pieces of that evolutionary environment, the brain often responds, which leads to the next evolutionary question. If modern environments shape how our brains age, what other parts of human biology are quietly responding to the same mismatch?